You look so cozy up there.
I know, I'm very cozy.
Think or swim. Maybe I don't need a microphone. We'll let Alastair have the microphone. I'm Carrie Barrett. I'm the director here at LongHouse Preserve. And
Carrie, you can use.
Is this your sixth lecture for us?
No.
Maybe
like
4,
eighth.
5, 8th?
Yeah, eighth.
No, it's just amazing. One of the things that new friends here today who said, what are you doing that makes LongHouse come alive? And programming, lectures is one of the biggest things we're doing. You're all here on a Sunday afternoon. You could be doing a lot of other things, but starting with Long Island Modern and now continuing with, what do you call this, Long Island Modern-ish? Expanded. And today about Buckminster Fuller. I won't say more about Alastair. You all know who he is. And by sitting in front of the dome, and it is shady, so it's nice and cool out today. And I think without further ado, I love your title, Think or Swim. Think or Swim.
Who's the artist?
Oh,
again?
and so the homage to Fuller is our friend, the artist Alice Hope, who has a studio out here in Amagansett, also in Brooklyn. And you have to get up close to these pieces to see them. They're actual rulers, like at least I used when I was a kid in school, American rulers that you would used to get, and they all have the name of a hardware store on them. Remember when rulers were free? Or any of you, like when you'd buy paint? I remember my father, they'd give you the stirrers and you'd stir them. And those stirrers also said, the title of the show is True Value, which is so lovely right now, but is also all over a lot of these rulers. And True Value just went out of business. Yet another thing. But they are engineered like a Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome. When you think about what it would have taken for Alice to sort of start with 1, start with 2, then with 5, then attach another one. You think about how these were constructed and the way that she actually studied some of Fuller's work to create these giant orbs. The obvious thing that I'll also say is that when you look at the one in the middle, it would be, what do they say, like building a boat in your basement. She had to build that here because it's bigger than any of the fly's eyes, right? So that also placed her here, kind of in residence, if you will, living in Amagansett, but coming to LongHouse every day over the period of about 2 weeks. So we loved having her here. And then figured out with her, so it was kind of like a seminar process, that they would hang. And we thought long and hard about that. We thought, would he mind? But you would know. Would he mind that we hung something from the dome?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
He'd love it. I think he'd take credit for it, though.
He'd take credit for it. Well, we want to hear more about that. I'm going to sit down and listen. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Can you all see this in the bright light? Good. So, Think or Swim is something that he would say because when he was about 32, he had a nervous breakdown. His first daughter, Alexandra, died of meningitis. And he took the blame because he felt he didn't get her to a good doctor in time. So he had a tremendous amount of guilt. And he stood on this bridge over the Chicago River, I think it was Michigan Boulevard, and was going to jump and kill himself. It was like 3 a.m. or something like that. And he then had this sort of, and I'll go into more detail later on it, but he had this sort of epiphany from the universe that everything he said from then on would be truth. So he didn't have to worry about proving himself. And that was his moment. Instead of swimming in the river or drowning in the river, he thought. So that's where that comes from. And I was using it for a seminar I did about 8 years ago at a university, and I got this really stern letter from a lawyer who said, cease and desist using, Bank of America, it wasn't Bank of America, it was another bank, I can't remember which bank it was, said cease and desist, that is now our motto for new investors. So I wrote a letter back, trying to look as legalese as I could, and just saying, well, then I'm going to sue you in the name of Buckminster Fuller, who coined this phrase. Anyway, so they backed off very quickly. I didn't have to go to court or anything like that. To begin with, this is going to be a little different than what I normally do, and thank you all for coming on such a beautiful day. I was commissioned to write a book about Fuller because there wasn't really now there is a pretty good biography. There wasn't really a single good book on Fuller. There were many, many books about different aspects of his career. So this is going to be a little bit about kind of meta about the task of actually trying to write about someone like this. And the truth is, a man is a pattern, And this goes through all his work from the earliest days when he was, so the first 4 years of his life, he was virtually blind. His parents just didn't believe in getting him glasses, corrective lenses. So for 4 years, he just couldn't see anything. He would just see these blurs. And this is at least part of his mythology that he created, that he would just think in these bigger scale patterns. So all his life, he had this sort of mega scale sense of space, and that somehow, if he could see the world as a unit, and I think he does get credit for at least being one of the first to really start thinking about the planet as a single sustainable entity, that if we didn't take care of it, he coined the term spaceship Earth. And this is a cover of Time magazine. 1964 was kind of his peak. This is a great illustration by Boris, I don't know how you pronounce his name, Ortzi Bashev, famous illustrator, showing him with the geodesic brain, or the head, a lot of his projects, including the Dymaxion car. This is this, obviously. And I think this is a great place to start, because here we are. I didn't know this artist's work, and I think it's wonderful. It's sort of like the Fly's Eye Dome has given birth to all these creatures kind of coming out. It's wonderful. This is actually a guy named John Kutik, who, like many disciples of Bucky Fuller, kind of reinterpret his ideas and go on and make their own thing. This is not actually technically a Bucky Fuller dome. It's a slight variation. A guy named John Warren. This is John Kutik who did this, and this is the model for it. So originally, like the artist's pieces inside, was going to be a sphere, not just a dome. The original idea of the Fly's Eye Dome was to have this instant housing that could be put up anywhere in the world for emergency purposes, or for, where there was just difficulty in building housing. So it would be a full sphere, and then, as you can see, does this work if I do? I forget. Yeah, does you see the little pointer? Yeah. Does that work? Yeah. So, in this area, so this was the floor, and underneath would be all the mechanicals, like heating, cooling, water, everything like that. And then, of course, you could just take it by helicopter, weighs very little. You could put it in any kind of mountainous region or waterfront. The idea was to, after an earthquake or terrible fires or disasters, it could be used. I'm trying something here. I'm calling it the Lost Manuscript. So I worked for quite a few years. I went out to Stanford. I had several foundation grants to do this, and Stanford got Bucky's total archives, which is just this vast, amount of material. Once he'd had that nervous breakdown at age 32, and he decided to recreate his life for the betterment of mankind, he called himself Guinea Pig B. And from then on, he would keep everything. He would be his own experiment. Everything he did. And so when you go to the archives, it's very hard to know what to ask for, because it's just, there are miles and miles of material. So you go, take a certain year. I want this week in 1935 or something, and then you get this huge, like box after box of stuff. And there's things like traffic tickets, in Boston from, when he was a drunk driver. There are letters from secret lovers. There's everything. He didn't edit anything out. So much to the embarrassment or humiliation of his family, researchers go there and they find this stuff, and it's hard not to talk about it. I included a lot of it in the manuscript I wrote. So I'm calling this the Lost Manuscript. I'm going to read you just very short. I usually don't do this, but I think it's interesting from this unpublished book. Usually I publish the books I write. Buckminster Fuller called himself a comprehensive anticipatory design science explorer. That's his name for himself. At other times he called himself an astronaut, or at other times he called himself a verb. Much of his thinking was about a, quote, stitching together of fragmentary parts in order to make the world, his and ours, whole again through his global trotting travels, inventions, rambling writings, and epic lectures. Sometimes he'd lecture. My father, who was a professor at Princeton, remembers him. He had a year at Princeton, actually, Bucky Fuller did. And he would do 12-hour lectures. So people would go, like 7 in the evening after dinner or whatever, and then they'd be there till, 7 in the morning. He was constantly mythologizing, telling a story, reworking his own mythology, reshuffling the narrative and adding new elements, something like an Aboriginal shaman who literally talks the universe into existence through ritual incantations. Even Fuller's geodesic and later tensegrity structures speak of a kind of gathering and stitching and unifying. In 2012, I was invited, I can't see this through this thing, I was invited to write a comprehensive biography of Fuller, pioneer of planetary awareness. The subject turned out to be far more complex and sprawling than I'd ever imagined. I could see no clear narrative path, and I soon understood why there hadn't been very many good books published about the man. He was a maddeningly elusive, a multifaceted personality who assumed too many different guises, roles as architect, engineer, urbanist, artist, poet, map maker, systems theorist, mathematician, inventor, futurist, and environmentalist. So for lack of any other plan, I began to draw a series of maps and plotted an imaginary road trip. I decided I would try to visit every important place in Bucky's life and interview every individual who he'd ever known, who was still alive. The idea was sort of being on the road with Bucky in search of Bucky Fuller, like Hunter Thompson's gonzo journalism, but without the drugs or booze, maybe some of the booze. By adopting the same kind of intuitive methodology that Fuller himself believed in, I was hoping to establish a network of physical and poetic links that, between his more cosmic ideas and the more mundane realities of his everyday life. Needless to say, he would have been canceled today before it even begun. For me, that was the story I wanted to tell. This in turn led me to other threads of inquiry, while others turned out to be remarkably fertile, including the rediscovery of several lost missing structures, which I'll show you in a minute. In some ways, this relatively random process of discovery became more substantial, more the work than the kind of linear research that I'd started out to do. When I presented a partial draft of the manuscript to Allegra Fuller, Bucky's 86-year-old daughter, she enjoyed the writing but was offended by the fact that I'd included anecdotes about his alcoholism and ex-marital lovers. I soon moved on to other, less demanding projects and let this one percolate in some dark storage unit until today. That's not true about today. So I'll go back to, so this is kind of how I started. I literally started to plot out, instead of just going to research facilities like Stanford's archives, I would try to go to as many of the places he actually had an impact. And of course, this is just 2 months into it, where I've it started with just a few places, and then it kind of grew into this insane, manic road trip, which I went on a little bit. I tried to keep, instead of using a computer, because Bucky was really pre-computer, I used an old typewriter or wrote by hand. This is when I went to Bear Island, which is where Bucky's family owns the island, and he grew up there, and sort of made a lot of his early discoveries just as a boy, playing around with all kinds of stuff. It still has no electricity or no power and no water. You have to sort of pump at the well, and there's an incredible outhouse that sticks out over this cliff. This is me this is Elizabeth Thompson on the left here, who was the director of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. This is at Stanford, and every time we went there to do research, these kind of strange characters would come out of the woodwork and show us their invention, because they'd hear we were going to be there. And I don't know who this guy is, but he was showing me this structure that he made. And, Elizabeth is trying to ignore him. And we had, the kind of a little bit tinfoil hat wearing crowd. And that's really a huge crowd that Bucky still attracts to this day. They're sort of figuring out the universe through a theory. He came from this incredible Brahmin Boston, New England family. That's Margaret Fuller in the middle, who was a famous transcendentalist. She was best friends with Emerson and Thoreau, and wrote these journals, edited a lot of their first works. Very early fierce feminist, editor, critic, died sadly very young, just off our beaches here, coming back from Europe with an Italian count. The ship ran aground somewhere near Bridgehampton, and they died. I don't know if everybody died, but she and the Italian died. So he grew up very intimidated by this legacy. They all were very Harvard-oriented. A lot of them were professors. Almost all of them went to Harvard. Bucky got into Harvard and got thrown out twice, which I think is a wonderful kind of accolade for his nonlinear thinking. Never did finish. Finally, Harvard, years later, gave him an honorary degree in poetry, of all things, which is kind of interesting. This is maybe the first structure he ever actually created, which was a crib for his little sister. And this is on Bear Island again. We're just working with driftwood and everything. He would pick this stuff up. So Little Liar, second part. I'm not going to read as much of this, but I was born cross-eyed and became a student of large-scale patterns, is what I told you a little bit earlier. He was small of stature and would only ever grow to 5 foot 2 inches. He was also cross-eyed and severely farsighted, almost blind. His first imprinting as an infant was devoid of solid, sharp edges, clearly delineated borders, and the immediate objects at hand, toys, furniture, books, were like ghostly shadows, he said. I could see only large patterns, houses, trees, outlines of people with blurred coloring. While I saw 2 dark areas on human faces, I did not see a human eye or a teardrop or human hair until I was 4 years old. His older sister Leslie would tell him wonderful stories about all the things she could see, but Fuller assumed that she was making it all up, just like the fairy tales she read to him in bed. So he started to make up equally fanciful tales about what he could see. I found that I could invent any kind of experience I wanted to, he recalled, and it made me very happy to have people laugh at my stories. From this point on, I would be a little liar. He would lie in bed pondering the cluster of luminous points he saw where others saw lights, wrote Hugh Kenner, who was one of the few guys actually who did. Hugh Kenner is an amazing Canadian literary critic, a historian who knew Bucky very well, and I think wrote, if there is one good book on Bucky, it's Hugh Kenner's Appreciation. It's more like a memoir, than a biography. At 4 years old, Bucky attended kindergarten still without glasses. The teacher sat him down at a table and showed him how to make little geometric structures out of toothpicks and dried peas. The other kids with normal vision knew about the shapes of houses and barns and instinctively tried to make square or cubic structures that easily collapsed. With my bad sight, said Bucky, I was used to seeing only bulks. I had no feeling at all about structural lines. But he quickly figured out that a triangle was the strongest, simplest plane. He could feel the strength of the elements within his little fingers, becoming aware of the fact that strength was not necessarily about weight. Quote, pushing and pulling, I found that a triangle held its shape when nothing else did, and I began to feel then that all nature's structuring and patterning must be based on triangles. Soon he figured out that 6 toothpicks held together with 4 peas could make a self-supporting tetrahedron, a 3-legged pyramid using the barest minimum of the material. Fuller had stumbled upon the key at age 4 or 5. Fuller had stumbled upon the key to his whole future. So as I mentioned, Bear Island, I won't dwell on this, because again, this is like, even putting this talk together, I thought, like, how do I keep it to like an hour or something? Because it's, it could be 8 hours easily. There's so much material. So I finally got to go there. That took the longest of all. I'd done all this research at Stanford and traveled around quite a bit, interviewing people. And finally, Allegra, the daughter, already like about 87, she invited me to Bear Island, which is in Penobscot Bay. It's pretty far out there, beyond the Fox Islands. And it's still owned by the Fuller family. As I said, there's no electricity. They've kept it it's pretty much exactly the same. So if there was something broken in 1884 that the great-great-grandmother had made, like there's a piano in the middle of the woods there that's still there, exactly as it had been left. That's Bear Island. That's sort of arriving. I went there in August 27th, 2013. That's Allegra waiting to greet me, not very warmly at all, but she has that flinty New England thing they all have, that he grew out of it, but he developed a very good sense of humor despite. So it just, I loved all the patterns of everything on the, and you look at these sea urchin shells and you can see his mind working in all these different, that's Saltay, which the island is covered in. That's the main house, at least, one corner of it. That's where I stayed, and there are about 5 or 6 houses. Half of the island is owned by another side of the Fuller family. Are there any Fullers here before I go on any further? Be honest. Okay, good. No, because they're amazing. It's an amazing family. But one half is kind of hates the Bucky's legacy because apparently he kind of optioned off the island to these very sketchy investors who were going to help pay for his Dymaxion car invention. And of course, he defaulted on the loan. And they came up to Maine and out to the island and said, this is our island now. And of course, the prickly other side of the family said, no, it's not. And I think they ended up paying these guys off. And so, internally indebted, the poorer side of the family has kind of got this side of the island. That's his bedroom where I get to stay, which is really nice. That's his little desk overlooking the fog of Penobscot Bay. So he really sort of shaped himself as an imaginative, original thinker. He was definitely way the outsider as a kid. First of all, because of his size, his vision. He gets into Harvard. He's basically a wild party guy too. So he gets thrown out twice not for academic reasons, but for social, recklessness and craziness, and is staying up all night and making too much noise and things. So up until his very end of his life, he was inventing things for rowing, like this rowing needle device that he made two of these that Craig Robbins, who's the great collector and the guy who did the design district in Miami and started Design Miami, he owns one of them. That's in the upper right there. So it's become this kind of art object. And the grandson, I think, found another one and he auctioned it off. So they went for quite a lot as sort of Buckminster Fuller objects. That's Jamie, the grandson. We circumnavigated the island the first couple of days I was there. The Salt House, which a lot of people kind of camp out in. It's very beautiful. I mean, again, it's like totally like it was in the 19th century. Jamie in one of the domes that he did with some friends. Then there's this great ruins of a pillow dome, which is a whole other story I'll tell you about, by an innovative designer named J. Baldwin, who I got to know before he died. And that's sort of the skeleton left. So you wander around the island, there's 19th century buildings and all kinds of old-fashioned Maine structures, and then there are these things from the 1960s and 70s popping up. That's a turtle dome that was built. Adjacent island called Little Spruce Island. You just take a boat across this channel, and there are a couple of these turtle domes on this island. And this is one of my favorite Bucky inventions. So he had a great collection of jazz in 78 records, and he didn't know how to organize them, so he created this just out of string and wire, so he could find different records. Just little things like this. Again, that's my journal from when I was there, and on this one here on the left, that's a piece of driftwood that he just found, and he made a rocking horse for his niece. And that's on the right. That's the same dome. I talked about the original pillow dome from 1970. 1917, he can't get in the army, but he gets, because of his eyesight, but he somehow gets into the Navy. He has this epiphany. The greatest secret of the Navy was doing more with less, where a little ship might be able to sink a big ship if it could move faster and outmaneuver it. And then he has this epiphany. I began to find that in calculating this, he was on a ship looking out the stern. The ship's white wake, I was dealing in quintillions to the fourth power times quintillions to the fourth power, or some such fantastically absurd number of bubbles, and nature was making those bubbles in sublimely swift ease. So he starts to begin and play around a lot with, this is very early on, with bubbles and the way bubbles adhere together and create other structures, and he was sort of taking photographs of them, and he made a little bubble machine on the island. The bubble is ephemeral, elegantly conceived, beautifully manufactured, and readily broken, says Bucky. This was a failed early attempt. He was having a hard time fitting into the world, and he had a wife, and he had this first baby, Alexandra. So he went into business with his father-in-law, James Hewlett, and they created a company called the Stockade Building System. The idea was basically take straw bales, something like straw bales made of fiber, fill them with plaster or concrete, and then create blocks and build these houses. But it failed pretty badly. Fuller's first child, Alexandra, a lovely little girl with big eyes and an infectious smile, caught the flu, then spinal meningitis. Yeah, this is sad, very sad. And then infantile paralysis. She died in 1923, just before her 4th birthday. Bucky felt responsible and faced the blackness of deep remorse. If she had had a proper environment, she would have lived, he said. He lost his sense of purpose and began to drink heavily. The Stockade Building Company went bankrupt, and he was faced with financial ruin. One day in 1927, he found himself wandering aimlessly along the banks of Lake Michigan, wondering what to do with his life. And then at the age of 32, this is what I told you earlier, he stood on that bridge on the Chicago River and considered suicide. It was jump or think, said Fuller, who chose to think rather than jump in favor of what he called a blind date with principle. You do not belong to you, he reassured himself. Therefore, you do not have the right to eliminate yourself. You belong to the universe. This was followed by an extraordinary out-of-body experience. A kind of burning bush moment that would forever change his life. I found myself in a sort of sparkling kind of sphere, and I heard a voice such as I had never heard ever before. And the voice said, "From now on, you need never await temporal attestation to your thought," said the voice. "You think the truth." Whether this was all a case of post-traumatic stress syndrome or whether it was a true mystical convergence or simply part of the Fuller mythology, it's not clear, but he emerged from his spiritual crisis renewed like an Old Testament prophet wandering out of the desert. He became a God-possessed man, like a messiah of ideas, said his best friend Isamu Noguchi. He was a prophet of things to come, said Noguchi. Fuller developed an uncanny awareness of scale, connection, and coincidence. Again, I usually don't ever read, but I just thought this was kind of an interesting idea. And this was as much about poetics as it was about science. He began to see everything, mammals, molecules, planets, in comparative clusters with wildly divergent shifts in scale, from the micro to the macro, and back again in the blink of an eye. He talked a lot about 9 chains of humans standing on each other's shoulders to reach the moon. You know, he thought in those kind of terms. He spoke about the weight of a building rather than its square footage. How all the people in the world could fit into England and each claim 150 square feet of personal space. I mean, he thought in those terms. That was so far out of the box of how scientists were thinking, or architects or engineers or planners, and other similar insights that pushed numerical data towards sometimes mystical ends. At all times nowadays, there are approximately 66 million human beings around Earth who are living comfortably inside their mother's womb, he wrote, inscribing a new territory that he dubbed Womb Land, a memorable image that engendered a new kind of global awareness. Stretching this concept even further, Fuller imagined all human embryos being connected somehow through a womb-to-womb telecommunication device, and the embryos would all agree not to come out until peace ruled on Earth. That's very Bucky thinking there. So this moment, you know, again, who knows how much of it is true, but he clearly did have a breakdown. He clearly was, badly alcoholic at this period. And he kind of, he then had, the big moment was Allegra, who you saw at 87 waiting to greet me on the dock there. She's born in 1927, and he really decided at that moment to change his life. I said about at age 32 to undertake an experiment in individual initiative. I undertook to see what a penniless, unknown human individual with a dependent wife and newborn child might be able to do effectively on behalf of all humanity. At this point, as I said, he called himself Guinea Pig B, and he started to keep everything. So when you go to these archives in California, there's this thing called the Dymaxion chronophile. And it's not all bound in leather, but a lot of it has been put together in these leather binders. And it's just everything. And you can see there's sketches for all kinds of concepts. There's everything. There's his bill from his dentist, in Cambridge. There's their drawings for whole new cities, endless photographs of friends, bus tickets in London. He kept everything. Somehow that this would be a record of his being. Early drawings after, again, you see the baby on the lower right, that's Allegra. So that baby gives birth, and then across from it directly is the heart for love, that he realized that was the main motivating force in the universe. And that he started to think of this idea of the world as a place. This is something that came up at auction about, 12 to 15 years ago. it somehow appeared. I think it was also the grandson again who was, rummaging around the attics on Bear Island and found this. This was Bucky's traveling case for all his little demonstration devices and models and stuff. I just think it's like a portrait of the man. I think it's wonderful. It went for quite a bit at auction, and I think a gallerist in New York got it and showed it. And then inside there'd be things like this. These are these models he would make with surgical tubing, as the connectors of various different geodesic forms. Man is beginning to think in terms of one world, and I think this is where really Bucky deserves all the credit in terms of, he inspired that whole generation. That is partly my generation. I'm a little young for it, but the '60s idea of the whole Earth, the whole Earth catalog, that catalog was dedicated to Bucky. There's a whole. If you look at any of the editions, it begins with a page on Fuller's vision of the universe. 2 billion homes. I must commit myself to reforming the environment and not man. Bucky estimated the need for 2 billion homes in the next 80 years and set about trying to solve the problem of world housing in a series of proposals for lightweight, factory-produced mobile dwellings that would evolve into the Dymaxion house and further variations on hexagonal or circular structures suspended from central mass, including the Dymaxion deployment unit, which we'll hear about later, which we actually rediscovered. People didn't think any of them existed anymore, and we actually discovered a couple. And the Dymaxion dwelling machine. The first Dymaxion house of 1929, which you see here, was an ultra-modern structure, but oddly quaint with its hexagonal floor plan and parasol roof. He was not selling this to a university. He was literally Marshall Field. He was showing it at Marshall Field department store in Chicago, trying to find a market. And you can imagine people coming in, middle-class Chicagoans coming in and seeing this kind of wild thing. And it's hard to see this on the right, but the central shaft, had all the mechanical equipment. But it was the beginning of again, he coined this. He actually didn't coin this phrase. Again, so much of what Bucky gets credit for, someone else did, and then he put his name. He was very good at that, and I guess that's a talent, right? Appropriation of other people's ideas. But he like this, this is not his, but it's like someone else doing him, and he put it together. It's the fact that he put it together. So when I interviewed a lot of widows of men, of scientists and engineers who'd worked with him over the years, a lot of them were very bitter and angry and didn't want to talk about Bucky because they felt their dead husbands then, had not gotten proper credit for what they'd done. And I think in many cases they were right, that these guys had done all the, he wasn't a mathematician. People thought he was, but he wasn't. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an architect. He didn't know, he knew how to put these universal concepts together, in a presentation, but he didn't actually know how to do the math itself. So this is actually a marketing guy at Marshall Field in Chicago. They're saying, how do we sell this crazy house? And he said, he made up this word, Dymaxion, from, a combination of dynamic, maximum, and tension. But then it became Bucky's, moniker for almost everything he did. I won't go too far into this. Gravity was no longer a controlling force, but was replaced by suspension, tension, and equilibrium. Fuller's inspiration came from dirigible mooring masts, the suspension bridge, the battleship mast, the Marconi rig, and Dymaxion plans were published in the June 1929 edition of Architecture magazine, and a model of the Dymaxion house was exhibited at Marshall Field's House of the Future show in 1929 in Chicago. That's, these drawings are very kind of, almost childlike early drawings. He really hasn't figured out his brand yet, as they say. But this is a hugely important, this is about 1928 to 1929. Again, he started to draw, he wanted to make a model of the Earth to show that it wasn't about countries, different continents, different countries. It was just basically one continent. There were no boundaries, from outer space you don't see it. Of course, we didn't have those images yet. So actually the artist's work in here, these geodesic spheres she created out of rulers and stuff, is very close to what he was starting to try to make, but he didn't know how to make them. and he called them geoscopes. And the idea was you could be able to look through them very much like these, but they would have made of tin or metal. They would have the continents floating on the surface of the sphere. And somehow he thought that before he could really convince people about one Earth, one world, working together, you know, as a unit instead of battling each other in war, an economic war, that somehow you needed to be able to visualize this thing as a single entity. This is kind of off track, but he was also trying to market a car, a three-wheeled car, which looks beautiful. Again, his friend Noguchi helped him out. These beautiful plaster models of the car, the three-wheeled Dymaxion car, and this was an ad for Fortune magazine. Just beautiful models of the thing by Noguchi. And he actually got money from some of these shyster kind of investment guys. And his family, he stripped his family's bank account like to pretty much zero investing and because he thought he'd make his fortune off this car. So this is a factory he took over in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and they actually got to manufacture it using a lot of aerodynamic technology. Some of the engineer mainly was this naval architect, Starling Burgess, who was a well-known racing yacht designer. And here it is, 1933. They have their first prototype. It goes to the Chicago Century of Progress World's Fair, 1933. Everybody gets to ride it for 10 cents or something like that. And then this famous race driver, who's a professional driver, he's driving it with several people in the back, and it tips over and kills him. He's dead, and that's pretty much the end of the Dymaxion car. It's not. I don't mean to make fun of the poor guy who died, but three-wheel cars are tricky, to say the least. So what was cool about it, though, and why it had so much potential as an urban vehicle was with the back wheel, you could turn it all the way over. And let's say you were in New York City or Chicago, you go up to a parking place. It was exactly the length of the car, and you could just wheel your way right into it. You put the front wheels in first, and then turn the back wheel all the way perpendicular to the front wheels, and just pull yourself in. But of course, as I said, that was sort of the end of that venture. And getting a little bit, again, he was always looking for a ready-made thing. Bathrooms are difficult, as any architect here knows. It's so many different parts and problems and issues of septic and where the water's coming from and the waste. So this was mildly successful as an invention, the Dymaxion all-in-one bathroom. So when you got it, kind of came in 1936, had the toilet, had a shallow bathtub, had the shower, had the sink, and you could just basically plug it in. It was all prefabricated. They sold some of these. In fact, there's one, I think where's Old Paith Village, like exit 48 or something like that. If you go to Old Bethpage Village, there's a building there that has one of these in it. That's you have to request, I think, to see it, because people have, there's graffiti on it, so it's been vandalized a little bit. But it does exist on Long Island, which I think is kind of funny. Sorry? Anyone seen it? No? Questions? This is the second iteration of the Dymaxion structure. And this is something I got involved with only because I was dying to connect with one of these things. And everybody told me, all the Bucky freaks I knew said, oh no, these were supposed to be for the Army, but they never went into fabrication, mass production. So this is Edgar Allan Poe. This is a stretch, but Bucky was somehow managed to merge science and new technology with poetry, with sort of the great literary traditions of American culture. So a friend of his who was a novelist said, I think I've heard there are these missing letters of Edgar Allan Poe at this house somewhere on the Mississippi River. I think I'm going to drive out there and try to find them. So Bucky said, yeah, I'll come with you. Okay. So this is kind of this thing. And it's Christopher Morley, who's a pretty well-known editor and novelist. In fact, he had just won a Pulitzer for a novel, and he had a bit of money. And they went out together, and the whole way out they were reading, this is during, 1940, 41, the U.S., it's before Pearl Harbor, So the U.S. is still not in World War II, but they're reading a lot about the devastation of the Blitz on London. And these are photographs they'd seen of, women out in the street, homeless women on the street, children on the street, these primitive kind of shelters that were made by hand about, trying to deal with the Blitz bombing, the German bombing of London. And as they were driving through this incredible, Midwestern landscape to get to this town on the Mississippi River, they kept passing these Butler corn cribs, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen them. They're corrugated round structures with corrugated galvanized metal kind of roofs. And they started to talk, and Bucky sort of got an idea, like, well, couldn't we somehow retool these Butler structures and make instant shelters, bomb shelters and just shelters for people who are homeless in London. And this is the kind of thing you find deep in the archives at Stanford. And I didn't notice this at first, but if you read on here, Chris Morley, the novelist, this is Bucky's writing, mails me data on Butler bins, which I had requested of Ralph Sargent at Galesburg, blah, blah, blah. Out of this, the Butler Dymaxion. So that's a great document. And then inside was all this material, advertisements and stuff from Butler farm equipment. They went to Kansas City after this, got in touch with the Butler company and said, is there a way, and Butler really responded to the idea, is there a way to make some kind of emergency housing out of what you're already making with some shifts? So they said yes. These are some very early drawings by Bucky and some other people. And then this is the first, you can see where the original the corn crib would have been, and then they added these sort of portholes around the side, these very thick glass portholes, a ventilation scoop at the top, but still pretty rudimentary. And as I said, later we found some. So I've been in them. You wouldn't want to live in them necessarily, but if you had to, it's better than being outside, obviously. So it turns out, and this is kind of a way you could add smaller versions to it, so there'd be living. The hard part is dividing it up into rooms, because they make these weird pie-shaped, kind of spaces. But this was an idea if you could have an extra bedroom or a kitchen. This is a really important letter I found from the Office of Production Management in World War II. This guy who had heard about them, a guy who worked for the Pentagon, and wanted to see them, was very interested in them. And this is one they built in Washington, D.C., not far from where the Pentagon is now, just so that government officials could come and see. And they did. They ended up, even though people said they hadn't, it turned out there was quite a lot of, I think they ordered over 100 to kind of test out to see how they'd use them for military purposes. They had a couple living in it to show that, people could live in it and make kitchens in it. And this is Bucky's sketch for a bathroom, how it would be a self-contained bathroom. It's hard to tell, but you can see the kind of the toilet there and the shower. Yeah, and the waste would come down here. And there'd be water and there'd be waste. Again, all sort of in one capsule, more living. Again, you can really see on that lower right image how tricky it was. So they kind of came up with these, I think they were asbestos even, these folding accordion kind of curtains that would be pulled across to give some kind of privacy. Then he gets this amazing offer to show one of the DDUs, the Dymaxion deployment units, at the Museum of Modern Art. So this is actually in MoMA's sculpture court, and there's Bucky himself up on the roof screwing in a screw while the guy in the background is smoking a cigarette, and just to get it up. And it was incredibly fast to erect these things. It was a very last minute thing. MoMA was doing a show about design for wartime situation, even though the U.S. wasn't in the war yet. It was like about 2 months before Pearl Harbor. So what was that? So October, November 1941. It got a lot of press, a lot of attention, and then of course Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. got into the war, and this is kind of our research. A couple of students helped me with this research of where, and the Pentagon, the U.S. military is amazingly helpful. They have incredible archivists
who were very interested in this and helpful about where could some of these have gone, the ones that were actually manufactured. So we figured they were used in Libya, Egypt, and elsewhere in the Middle East because of this whole, flying the hump supplies to both China, to the nationalist Chinese who were fighting the Japanese, but also to the British forces fighting Rommel in the desert of Libya and Algeria. So we ended up finding these government photographs that were showed the DDUs at, we don't know if this is in Libya or Egypt or somewhere else in the Middle East, and those are U.S. pilots. So they were used basically as dormitories for exhausted pilots who'd flown across, from Brazil across to Dakar and then up through the desert. So these guys were exhausted and they just needed 3 or 4 days of rest, and they would sleep in these things. And there's another one. But this is kind of amazing. So, we never got there to find these, and God knows if any of these exist. Then we learned from basically Google Earth, that there were some interesting looking things in this Camp Evans, which had been a World War I camp and then became a World War II. And it was where a lot of the radar research was done in World War II. This is Google Earth, and we just went, what are those things, This is an abandoned military base in New Jersey near Shark River. And we thought, are those oil tanks, or are they, whatever, DDUs? So finally, through this very nice high school science teacher who knew a back way into, because it was totally closed off because it's so toxic. There's all kinds of shit, horrible stuff there. Nuclear probably, or at least, a lot of asbestos and mercury and stuff like that. So it's totally a super fun site. They've closed it off. But this the local high school science teacher said, no, I know how to get in there. There's a little break in the fence at the back. So we kind of went in. And there are all these great buildings like this. Again, this is the process of discovery. I thought Bucky would admire this approach, right? We're just going to break in through the back door. And then we turn the corner, and there's the first one, which is really like a wonderful moment. And it's sort of beautifully, overgrown with poison ivy and everything. And it turned out there were about 8 or 9 of them there. And we did try to negotiate. I've learned a lesson from this. I stupidly wrote a piece in the New York Times because I thought it was such a cool discovery story. Of course, it just made the local town board, who had no interest in this place otherwise. They sound like, well, those are probably valuable, really valuable. They're like art objects, because someone wrote about them in the New York Times. I said, I wrote about them in the New York Times because, we discovered them here. And they wanted a fortune for each. We were just going to take one and restore it for the design show in New York, and another one was going to go to the design show in Miami. And they wanted, way too much money. I mean, they shouldn't be more than like $10,000 or something. So they're still there, if anyone wants to try to get them. I'd still love to preserve one before they, you could definitely clean it up and, paint it well and preserve it for another 100 years. And that's my high school friend, my high school science teacher, whose name I completely forget, I'm sorry. But isn't that a great shot from inside? And that's the New York Times photographer took that one. I didn't take that. But they were kind of amazing. But we learned that they weren't used as bomb shelters as they had been intended to for London, but they were being used because they were experimenting with explosives inside, so that if something blew up, which apparently did happen in one of them, no one on the outside would be hurt. So they had to kind of reverse. This is another one in Monmouth, New Jersey, on the roof of the Meyer Center. Again, these sort of scattered around. This is the most interesting cultural DDU. We found the remains of one at Bennington College, where Martha Graham had lived in it for like a couple of years, hated it because it was like too hot in the summer, too cold in the winter. And her lover lived in there and finally resigned from Bennington College because it was so horrible. So there's a whole like legacy of this Martha Graham story, because Allegra, the reason it's at Bennington was Allegra, again, the daughter who greeted me on the dock in Maine. She was a modern dancer and went to Bennington to study with Martha Graham. So I think in lieu of paying her tuition, Bucky just offered them one of the DDUs, and they used it for faculty housing. And then the next iteration, and they only built one of these, is the second Dymaxion house, which again was sort of engineered by, built like an airplane, stainless steel. They only had one. It was called the Wichita House. Cynthia Lacey helped. This is a graduate student who worked with Bucky, and he had an affair with, and they created this whole, I won't read you this whole thing, but they created the secret language that's, if Bucky's wife came across it, it would sound like some kind of, like C2 to married signal, C2 to married signal, you're coming in fine, our transmitter here has been jammed. And it was sort of just their secret lovers' messages to each other. I know this is why he couldn't stop this project, because there were so many different levels. This is an aviation engineer worker working on the roof cone, which could spin around with different. So if the wind was coming out of the northeast, you'd shift it around to either get ventilation or closed ventilation. That was the whole idea. They only built one, and it ended up, if anyone ever goes to the Ford Museum, Greenfield, near Detroit. So it was finished in 1946. The idea was that they would build whole communities out of these things. They only ever made one. There it is at Greenfield Village, the Henry Ford Museum, in pretty wonderful shape, in the interiors. This is really the moment, and I spoke about Black Mountain College the last time we did a talk here. This is really where he found his kind of, his homies, his friends, creative people like Robert Rauschenberg and Merce Cunningham, and the de Kooning, and all these wonderful artists who converged 1949 in North Carolina at Black Mountain College, where he was able to use the students, work with students, but also, Elaine de Kooning was out there, trying to figure out this. He still hadn't figured out the geodesic dome formula. So this is him working with, remember Venetian blind material, sort of metal that was cupped, that was quite sharp. And he thought he could somehow transcend the thinness of that material. And of course, it just never, the students called it a floppahedron because they kept getting it up and then it would collapse. But he did figure out all kinds of other stuff, like this one, which the necklace dome, which again, one guy could carry this around, but like it could support the weight of however many guys were there. So that was really in that very creative, stimulating atmosphere of this couple of years at Black Mountain College. I think he really found him, his direction of how to go forward in a very collaborative way with other people's help. And this is his little laboratory at Black Mountain on the left there. And one of these early balloon kind of domes that were self-supporting. This is one of the first, I'm not going to go into detail because there are millions of, or not millions, but there are thousands of iterations of a geodesic dome. This is a very early one that was built in Montreal in 1950. That's a great photograph of the guys putting it together. The first real practical use was for the Ford Motor Company Rotunda in Dearborn, Michigan, 1953. It wasn't the whole building, it was just the roof over the central rotunda. Again, this is what I mentioned earlier about the artist's work. This was the first, again, it was him trying to, this is a geoscope at Cornell University in 1952, working with his architecture students at Cornell. The idea was to show these land masses as pure forms. Again, it's hard for us to imagine this because we know 3D, computer 3D animation. We've seen the Earth from moon and from outer space, so it's not some abstract concept for us, but it was still then, which is hard for us. It's like thinking, what's life pre-Google? This is life pre, Earth as a single concept. A dome restaurant, and again, I just kind of grabbed a whole bunch of stuff, but this is an early restaurant, 1953 in Woods Hole. That's him. I have it in just because I love that picture of him hanging from a rope from the roof to show how strong his framework was at Woods Hole. A local professor with a little dome house. Again, this is a strange thing, because he's so associated with kind of the 60s countercultural hippie revolution. But his first real application where he actually made some money off of the geodesic concept was the U.S. Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. They thought it was a great idea for instant shelter, like either for storing equipment or for storing troops in a difficult area. This is, I don't know who did this incredible, concept illustration of Marine helicopters dumping these, with the tank firing and they're dropping it. But there it is, there it's actually realized. That's not in a wartime situation, but that's Fuller standing there watching a helicopter, pick up this 30-foot geodesic dome and show how easily it was. So he really impressed the military. At the same time, he's working, again, all of these shapes, all of these mathematical and engineering concepts come out of his initial idea of the Earth as this single being. And he realized, especially as politics of the Cold War became so much more, fractious and difficult and scary, and life-ending, that the problem was we weren't seeing the world as it actually was. The regular map is highly distorted. We see the Atlantic Ocean because that's politically placed, so Europe's here and, North America's here and Russia's here. And if you look at this Dymaxion, it's called Air Ocean World Map that he did with this very brilliant Japanese cartographer, Saito. You realize that North America and Russia are like so close to each other if you're dealing with the North Pole. So that whole concept really started to be picked up by the U.S. defense military, early warning defense system. So this line, which is the early warning line along the Arctic Circle, these were radar installations that Bucky designed. These radar, they're called radomes. They basically protected the radar from freezing cold winds, but it was very much part of the Cold War defense system. At the same time, because of his military connections, he started to work with the State Department. There was the famous trade fair in Kabul, Afghanistan, which Kabul was still a thriving city, right? And but there was great threat of, they were worried about communism, obviously. So, everybody else put up these fantastic trade fair kind of shows. The U.S. didn't have anything on hand. So at the last minute, Miller said, this guy Bucky Fuller has interesting structures. So they called him up. Within a few weeks, he was able to send all this. Some Pashto, now these guys would be Al-Qaeda or something, but they were Pashto tribesmen who were able to figure it out and put it together in less than 2 days, this structure, which is kind of amazing, that structure. And that it became the most popular, they showed how wonderful American democracy was inside and all that kind of stuff. And, you could come to America and drive a car and own a house and even a weekend house in the Hamptons. Now I put that part in. But after the Jeshin Trade Fair in Kabul, the U.S. State Department really started to work with him a lot, and they did similar domes all over the world: Bangkok, Accra, Lima, New Delhi, et cetera, et cetera. But the biggest one by far, the most impressive one by far, was the famous 1959 trade fair between Moscow and New York City. I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember it, but on Columbus Circle at the exposition hall there, the Soviets had their show, and it was sort of, women driving tractors and, big hefty photographs of cows. I mean, it's incredibly boring and terrible show, and no one went to it. But in Moscow was this sort of explosion of American capitalism, the best of American capitalism. I mean, there were Jackson Pollock paintings. There was the great Bucky Dome in the middle, which became the center of, the Charles and Ray Eames did this amazing multimedia. I mean, Soviet citizens had never seen anything like this. There were American fashion shows. There were whole displays of women's hairdos, and it just was crazy. And the KGB started just infiltrating and preventing people. I love Nikita Khrushchev, has his name wrong, but Mr. J. Buckingham Fuller must come to Russia and teach our engineers. Well, he did come. He did this extraordinary Alcoa aluminum roofed geodesic dome. Again, for the, I don't have, there are great images of what the Eames, Charles and Ray Eames did for the show. I mean, there are like multiple screens, and it's basically it was a day in the life of Americans. And it starts in the morning, and all these incredible things, and cars, and farms, and cities, and it was, and no one ever seen anything like it. Incredibly loud music inside this amazing architectural space, and this incredible multimedia. I mean, it was just too much. And this is a lovely photograph. So these are the American women attendants, and that's the gold anodized dome in I never know how to pronounce this. Sokolinki Park, Moscow, 1959.
Can you pronounce it? What was it? Sokolniki.
Thank you. I knew someone here would be able to. And then again, similar Kaiser aluminum. This took off everywhere. This one is sort of amazing because it was one of the first. Honolulu, 1957. They erected in about 2 days, and by the third day, they were able to have this huge concert inside for thousands of people. It just showed how amazing these were, and they really did take off. This period, late 50s to through the 60s, you had hundreds of these structures being built, not only in North America but around the world. This is a Union Tank car company, this huge dome for gas. It was Virginia Beach. You see the model there. Again, that similar to his early housing ideas. You had this sort of mast in the middle that could lift the whole structure up. And again, all the prefabricated parts would go together very quickly. This is one I like. This happened to like in Reno, Nevada. But again, there are just dozens and dozens of these around the country. And he thought, he always thought in this macro, ridiculous, over-the-top scale. Just pushing the limits of, I think that's where he was a poet and an inventor at the same time. And this was going to be built over Manhattan, 1960. It would measure 2 miles wide by 1 mile high, spanning from the East River to the Hudson at 42nd, and from 22nd Street in the south to 62nd Street in the north. But this inspired so many countercultural sort of visionary designers of this period. This is one of the first houses that really adapted the geodesic dome for living. This is Bernard Judge's house in Hollywood Hills, 1963. The famous expo, I'm sure a lot of you went to this, 67 in Montreal. It's called now the Biodome. It's in actually pretty good shape. That's a picture of it, 67, but then it burned in 76. So it had this steel structure, but then was covered in this acrylic plastic, kind of filter, these panels that were turned out to be highly flammable and highly toxic too, you can imagine. So this image, but it burned away, the fire burned away the noxious plastic, and that's me in 2008, and it's sort of been beautifully restored, so it's just the structure without the plastic. Outlaw area. So all human advances occur in the outlaw area, he said. No one was quite sure what he meant by this, but it really inspired that 60s generation. I'm going to give a talk later, I think in early October, about that period, and I don't want to say too much about it now, but that generation really took him more seriously than even the military or the aeronautic generation. They saw Bucky really as a messiah of a kind of new way of seeing. The Vietnam War was on. They were, draft dodging young men who were escaping the draft, going out to the, wilderness. And these are suburban kids and urban kids who suddenly were learning how to, live in the outdoors, create new communal systems of living. And he was their guy. And this is a community that was really devoted to Bucky's vision. The works of art we envision are total vast, said Bill Voigt. These were students from Kansas City, art students of Alan Capro, and they wanted to live year-round. So these were kind of variations on the geodesic dome, built from car tops. They found if they went to a car auto graveyard, they could chop them out for free. They could chop, or for almost nothing, like for 20 cents or something. They would chop out these pieces of metal. So the reason you get that kind of patchwork color is that was the color of the different cars and trucks that they took this metal from and then fused it. Of course, the problem was it always leaked. They all leak terribly. They all still leak. Domes tend to leak. It's very hard to seal them. And of course, with new kinds of sealants, now you really can. It's a lot better, but it was pretty bad then. But this is this vision of this future, kind of funky, but very futuristic at the same time. These were red diaper babies, whose parents were the Red Rockers. I interviewed quite a few of them. I mean, amazing group of young people who left L.A. Most of their parents had either been writers or directors or actors who'd been blackballed, in the communist crackdowns of the 50s. And they'd grown up super radical. and they just, they built I think it is one of the biggest, like at least hippie domes of the period. It was 60-foot diameter Red Rock. You can see these great cartoon on the left. They all live together, in this funky mosh pit with babies screaming and, people smoking pot and, making love and playing guitar all at the same time. And this is Libre Commune, which was, again, a reaction against, the problem with Drop City was so many runaway druggy teenagers started to come there because Esquire magazine did a story about, hey, here's the first hippie commune, which it wasn't really. It was really artists, doing theater, experimental theater, like here. It was more like here. And they said, we can't look after like 16-year-old runaways, so they bought up this incredibly remote land in the mountains of Colorado that was impossible to find. It's still impossible to find. And created, the only rule was you had to build your own structure, and you couldn't see it from another structure. It was sort of like hippie suburbia. J. Baldwin, yeah, I'll just read quickly because I should finish up soon. Sunday, May 12th, 2013, Pengrove, California. I drive north through Marin County past Petaluma, Route 101, exit onto Railroad Avenue. Small farm lots, old barns, sheds, prickle hedges, and honeysuckle. It's not a commune, says J. Baldwin, coming out to greet us, but it's a shining hill that rises to the west from Pengrove Valley with 7 tiers of chicken coops restored by old hippies and student squatters. This is J. Baldwin, who's a great guy. Jay and Liz, his wife, have been here longer than anyone else since 1963. Is it possible, he asks himself, same year that Kennedy got shot, just 2 months earlier, he says. Their domesticated coop has low sloping ceiling, but it's attached to a larger barn where Jay stores all of his experiments. Jay and Liz did all the work in the house themselves, and they managed to live on $8,000 a year, happy and fine and very low impact. We eat a lunch of fresh berries, homegrown lettuce, cucumbers, cheese, and lemonade, while Baldwin tells me about his long friendship with Bucky Fuller, how he first met him in Ann Arbor after one of Bucky's all-night epic lectures. They met again in the fall of '69 when Bucky came to visit Pacific High, the free-form hippie high school in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where Baldwin and fellow domehead Lloyd Kahn were teaching students how to build domes. So together they built, this is Pacific High, which is a crazy experiment between '69 and '74. These are kids, they weren't so much runaway kids, they were just kids who were smoking too much pot, and they were throwing them out of the regular high schools in California. So they got this, sort of very kind of Montessori type, even more out there, group of teachers in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And the idea was that the students would learn some kind of sense of responsibility and groundedness by learning how to build domes. And then they lived in the domes, and they were taught in the domes, and that became the kind of focus. It's the student-run school. There's the headmaster. They're all naked in the bathtub zone, which was once a week. You got to have a bath together. Now imagine how canceled that guy would be today. But they're all very happy. That's 2 of the dome teachers, Lloyd and another guy whose name I forget. The pillow dome, which Jay Baldwin I just told you about, that's Jay's girlfriend. That's Jay on the upper right. This pillow dome, which is great, that's the Om dome. That's the yoga teacher on the lower left, and he basically took these, made these transparent vinyl pillows filled with hydrogen that were made by believe it or not, in San Francisco, a company that made plastic women porn dolls or something like that. I never understood what it was, but they created these triangular pillows that then would be sewed onto the geodesic structure, and that's the one he did in Maine and Bear Island. Again, long ago before I got there, the plastic had evaporated in the harsh Maine fog and salty wind. That's another one at Pacific High. New Alchemy. I'll move through this very quickly. Back to here. Again, the early iteration of this was created not by Bucky Fuller at all, although he was obviously in collaboration. This guy John Warren, who I got to meet about 12 years ago. John is an amazing guy. John actually was sort of one of the most famous surfboard shapers. So again, these guys aren't coming out of MIT, or Princeton or Stanford. They're coming out of just whatever, And he was fascinated by Bucky's work. He was a master of fiberglass work. So he came up with the concept of the fly's eye, took it to Bucky, he made these different models you see here. That's an early 23-foot diameter one on the right, upper right. That's John I had lunch and dinner with him in Palo Alto in 2015. He's an amazing guy. And no one really knows who he is. I told the University of San Diego, I said, this guy lives just outside of San Diego. Just have him in and to give a lecture, because he knows more than anybody about this. So they did, and the students loved him. Again, this is this one. This is the 50-foot. This is the last story. Created again through John's work with Bucky, 1979, 1980 in Los Angeles, the Temcor company that made things like, they made surfboards, they made architectural structures. That's Bucky standing in front of Fly's Eye Dome, 1980. This is the biggest one ever made that I know of. Yeah, I think so. It was actually commissioned for the bicentennial, Los Angeles bicentennial in 1980. It's really ugly with these bug eyes over them. This was for fiberglass lenses over the openings. Of course, it's much more beautiful with just the openings. But this was, you'd go in here underneath, and there was like historical displays and kind of stuff like that for about a year. Everybody hated it. And, here's the review by this guy, John Dreyfus, in the LA Times. Hovering over the exhibit, the dome is like a bloody nose on an attractive woman. The whole thing looks like a toadstool with terminal warts. So not well loved by the people of Los Angeles. This is another great story. I love these kind of discovery moments. So 1980, everybody hated it. It was just shipped away, and no one knew what happened with it. Basically, people thought they'd just thrown it out. They'd taken it to this farm up in Sebastopol, California, and put it in a barn and stuff. And just through, again, Google Earth, people just flying, watching, Google Earth, started to notice these things. And the barn on the left, which you can hardly see, had all these, the components that you see on the lower right. And then in the field were these ugly lenses that had been on the original piece. So they went and found it. And our friend Bob Rubin, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, I invited him, but he's, he owns the golf course in Bridgehampton and had all these events today. But he heard about this, and he basically, those are the lenses. He basically bought the whole thing, had this amazing place in LA that specializes in fiberglass restoration, fixed all the parts, put it together, and then started sending it around the world. And this is the first site, was in Toulouse on the Garonne River, 2013. They have a big arts festival in Toulouse, and that's it on the site in Toulouse. Yeah, beautiful. And of course, it was a perfect foil for these wonderful light shows. This is a light show in Amsterdam, December 2013. So like a month or two later, it's shipped up to Amsterdam for this festival of light. And now it's permanently on display in Bentonville, Arkansas, at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. And this, I just wanted to throw this in because this is, so, the way this is in a pure, provenance Bucky. Behind us, it doesn't really matter. This is, a Craig Robbins talk about luxury. I think Bucky maybe would turn in his grave. Maybe he would like this, I don't know. The 23-foot diameter, again, it's not an actual Bucky Fuller or John Warren Fly's Eye Dome, but it's used as the entry to the luxury underground parking in the Miami Design District. It's surrounded by Bulgari and all these super expensive, luxury shops. So this idea of a housing unit like this one, that was supposed to be for world housing, for affordable housing, for emergency rescue, becomes this great, decorative bauble for the super rich and so on. So when I die, we'll still be somewhere around 140 pounds, said Bucky. And you can throw that away because that's just yesterday's cereal, which I kind of love that. He died within 2 days. So he goes to see Anne Hewlett, his long-suffering wife, but very faithful and loving. She's very sick in the hospital in Los Angeles. He goes to see her. in July 1983. He dies. She doesn't die, he dies when he goes into the hospital. He's not even in the hospital, he's just visiting her. And then she dies 3 days later. So, and then on the stone above, this is a whole long story I won't go into, but his saying was, "Call me trim tab." Does anyone here know what a trim tab is? So I'm sure someone does. But at the following edge of a giant tanker ship, let's say there's the rudder in the back, in the stern, and you need, the rudders are so huge and the ships are so huge that you need a kind of mini rudder on the rudder to get the rudder to come around, especially if you're doing a fast turn. So his idea of the trim tab was that a small person, one single person, guinea pig B, could change the whole world, could shift the whole world around that way. That was the meaning of that. And that's me there. Thank you very much. That's kind of it.